What happens when there aren't enough workers to power the economy? Who fills the jobs that have long driven American growth? How should policymakers respond right now, not decades from now? Welcome to Baker Briefing, where we make the news make sense. I'm David Satterfield, Director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. Tonight, we're going to be unpacking what global population decline means for American cities, economic planning, and the policy decisions shaping our future. But of much more immediate interest, certainly to me, and I think to most of you in this room, Houston is not growing. Contrary to the common wisdom that Houston will uniquely always grow, no, it always will not. No, it right now is not. And the demographics, the forensics of why that has been the case, how long it has been the case, what's the case for Texas as a whole, not just for Houston and Harris County, is something that Bill King will be discussing tonight, along with the implications of all of this. Now, Bill King is Baker Institute Fellow in Public Finance. He's the former mayor of Kemah, and he's the author of the recent book, which he has been signing out there, Depopulation, Our New Demographic Reality. Thank all of you who will be listening to this outside this room for tuning in, and let's get to the questions. So, Bill, paint the demographic picture for us. Give us the numbers, and let's start with Harris County, with Houston, and then you can go out from there to the world.
So Harris County, its growth has been limited to international immigration for the last decade or so. When you start talking about the population growth or decline in a particular jurisdiction, you have to take the natural, which is the number of births to exceed deaths. You take domestic migration, people moving to that location from someplace else inside the country, and then international immigration. So last year in Harris County, the number of kids that were born just about offset the number of people that moved out of Harris County to someplace else in the United States. It was the 10th year in a row that we had negative domestic migration for Harris County, 30,000 people. The only reason that Harris County grew last year and grew robustly, I'm talking about 24, we don't have the 25 numbers yet, was because about 100,000 people moved here from another country. Of course, that has come to a grinding halt in the last year. So when we get the Harris County numbers this year, we're going to see a pretty dramatic decline from the sort of growth that we've seen in the past. And I want to emphasize this is a global phenomenon. This is happening all over the world right now. And 75% of the world today is already at or below what's called the replacement rate, which means that women in that country are having less than 2.1 children. And there is no place in the world that's falling below that level that's ever recovered above it. And there is no place in the world today where the birth rate is going up. So we are living in part of a little microcosm of a global phenomenon.
So, Bill, when you and I chatted before we all came into this, I said, what about all those signs that over the last 5 years you saw on people's yards around Houston inside the loop? Do you remember why you moved here from California? Not happening anymore?
So that was going on very dramatically about 3, 4, 5 years ago. But 3 years ago, it started declining. In 2022, we had 220,000 people move into Texas from another state. Last year, that was 67,000. A 3/4 decline just in 3 years. And we can speculate about what the reasons for that are. But this is, generally speaking, happening across the country. Florida's domestic migration is down by 90% in the last 3 years. And so this idea that everybody's leaving all the blue states and going to the red states, that was a phenomenon that was going on 4 or 5 years ago. But today, it's really slowed down a lot. One thing I tell people that if you're in demographics, if you're talking about things in the past, you're looking the wrong direction. It's kind of like the famous hockey player said, skate to where the puck is, not where it's going to be, where it is. But that's the kind of phenomenon. You've got to be looking at what the current trends are. And demographics is one of those places we can kind of see around the corner a little bit because of the generational nature of human reproduction. So if you only have a certain number of mothers being born this year in terms of number of potential mothers for mothers, we know in the next generation how many there'll be. So we can project these things out a little bit. Immigration is the wild card.
Now, Bill, focusing just on internal, domestic migration patterns, what about Rust Belt, Sun Belt moves? Is that diminishing as well?
All of that's slowing down. There's still some of that going on. There's certain places in the country get popular. Right now, the Carolinas are very popular. Tennessee is very popular. There are actually more people moved into North Carolina from other states last year than moved into Texas. It's the first time we've been displaced as the number one state in a long time. There's a lot of reasons for these different phenomenons. One thing is we're still very tired of the oil and gas industry, and that's at least I think we all agree it's a mature industry, not growing rapidly. I think the politics of Texas have done some brand damage. The storms along the Gulf Coast have done some brand damage. But in addition to that, there's an overall demographic pattern that we need to talk about for a second, and that is that people move a lot less as they get older. As you think about it, you're established, you've got kids, you've got grandkids, you've got the church you want to go to, all those sorts of things. So if you're 50 or 60 years old, you're much less likely to pack up and move across the country than, say, a 20 or 30-year-old. Well, what's happening to us in the United States right now as the population is beginning to level off is we're dramatically getting older. The median age right now in the United States is 39. So by the time you get to be 39, most of your moving days are behind you.
And Bill, talk about this. How does the U.S. and these phenomena compare with Asia, with Europe?
So Southeast Asia and Europe are kind of the poster childs for population decline. In Japan today, there are 9 million vacant houses. In Japan, they sell more adult diapers than they sell baby diapers.
That's a great fun fact.
Yeah. Looking around the demographics of all of us in this room,
I don't want to look around too closely. No.
China is a remarkable phenomenon. The UN's current projection for China is that by the end of this century, they will have about half the population they have today. Now, we don't have a historical analog for what it looks like for a country, especially the size of China, to lose half their population in 75 years.
And let me just pause on that. We don't have a market or economic model for what happens when a major consumer, a major market economy like China, halves itself in terms of the global economy.
Western Europe especially is pretty much demographic decline already, especially Southern Europe and Scandinavia. Eastern Europe, birth rates are a little higher there, but then all the countries there are below the replacement rate. The United States would look a whole lot like Southeast Asia and Europe today were it not for the fact that everybody in the world still wants to come here. We're the one place in the world where everybody would still like to come live here. There's only a handful of countries where this is true. Nobody's trying to climb a wall to get into China or to Russia, But here, because of the rule of law, because of the basic freedoms we have, because of a robust economy, a lot of people still want to come here. It's a tremendous advantage for us if we could figure out how to do it right. Unfortunately, we don't, because of our partisan bickering, we don't seem to be able to develop a rational immigration policy. But we could basically delay depopulation in the United States for decades if we could figure out how to do immigration right.
Bill, please talk about the numbers. If you were to restore what is assumed as a mean of historic immigration, which is about 1 million a year nationally, what would that do in terms of pushing back that population flattening and decline?
The Census Bureau has run some scenarios. They ran one scenario that was letting about 1 million people a year in. Our population increases to about 350 million people sometime around between 2040 and 2050, and then it starts a long-term decline, something that's very manageable. If you say zero immigration, we're not going to let any more immigrants into this country ever, then we start losing population in about 2 or 3 years, and by the end of this century, we will have 100 million fewer people in the United States than we have today. We'll lose almost a third of our population.
With all those numbers, stark as they are, it's kind of difficult to see this decline in daily life, Bill, at least so far. Stadiums are full. Grocery stores are packed. The job market is tight in many places and in many sectors. So what does demographic decline predictably look like? When do we start seeing it?
So you can look around some places now and see it, and the most obvious place is in the schools, because the way this works, there's something called a population pyramid. This is a graphic device that was developed back in the 50s and 60s, and you take every 5-year cohort and you stack those on top of each other. And so back in the 50s and 60s, because all the populations were growing, those looked like pyramids. So they called them population pyramids because that 0 to 4 cohort was always the biggest number. But if you look at the United States or say even Texas today, what you see is kind of a pineapple-shaped device, and it comes in at the bottom. It gets narrower at the
The
bottom.
inverted pyramid that we're seeing now.
And so that means that we've got fewer 0 to 4 than we have 5 to 9, than we have 9 to 14. And we're seeing this all over in the schools. Aldi's closed, I think, 7 or 8 schools. Spring just announced they're closing 2. HISD's closing a dozen. They need to close about 3 dozen. But it's happening in places you wouldn't expect. Fort Bend ISD is closing schools. Frisco up in Dallas is closing schools. This is happening all over because this is a global phenomenon that's affecting everything.
We're going to get back to that with some very interesting statistics, some of which we can take credit for here at Baker and Kinder. But before we move off of this, if federal, state, and local governments keep planning on the basis of some steady population increase, where are the risks here, Bill?
This is my biggest concern, and I'm going to give you a real-life example. There's a group called the Transportation Advocacy Group, and it's mostly a bunch of road contractors, engineers, and that sort of thing. And they had a big meeting out at the Galleria, and Director Williams, who runs TxDOT, was at the meeting, and he got up and he said, we need all this money because we have 1,500 people a day moving into the state of Texas. And he got up to this whole group there and said, we got a plan for this. We got to get ready for all these people. We got to build more roads. Well, that was true about 5 years ago. Last year, 564 people were moving in, and that was with a bunch of international immigration. This next year, there might be 100 or 200,000 move in. So this is the big risk that we have. HISD had this bond for $4 billion, I guess it was, to build a bunch of schools and redo a bunch of schools. And I looked at it, and they called me to see if I'd endorse the bond. I'd actually run the bond campaign in 2012 for HISD. And I looked at it, and I said, wait a minute, you guys are building 28 new schools here. I don't understand why we're doing this. And I ended up, not getting involved in either side. But I think that would have been a mistake in retrospect to go in and build that many schools when we probably got a quarter of the schools and HISD are less than 60% enrolled right now. And so what we've got to do is start thinking about not assuming there's always going to be more people. So we're going to need less of everything. We don't need as many freeways. We're not going to need as many office buildings. We're not going to need as much groceries or cars or anything you can think of it. Going forward, we're not going to need as many of them as we did in the past.
Now, Bill, the conversation we just had here on recognition of school closures, including Fort Bend, places you wouldn't expect are reducing. Roll the clock back 7-8 months. When you and I talked about this, you were very concerned that while some in the city of Houston knew the real numbers, there was no reflection of this. There were no school closures, bruited about, none at all. And many were denying even that the population decrease was underway. We, then Kinder, joined in a joint approach to the city on this. This is now accepted for city planning purposes, but it wasn't a year ago. So this is not everybody has seen this coming for a decade. No, there was a suspension of disbelief in what was going on.
There's something I call the Chamber of Commerce bias, which is
suspension of disbelief. Yeah.
Which is, if you're trying to sell a place, and if you're an elected official, everybody loves the place they live, right? And so if it's such a great place, surely everybody else in the world wants to move to where you are, And if they're not moving here, then it sort of undermines your belief about what a wonderful place it is. And so we have this natural tendency to think that everything is growing wherever we happen to be. I use this statistic all the time, and nobody ever believes me when I tell them this, but it's true. The population of the city of Houston hasn't changed in 10 years, and 2.3 million people for the last 10 years. But the population of Houston inside Loop 610 today is about the same as it was in 1960, 60 years ago.
Now, Bill pulled that on me, and I thought, well, that can't be the case. Then I thought about it, and I asked you to do the same. Think about that. If Bill had said population is lower than in 60, you could even rationalize that. Bungalows are converted into multi-lot, single-family dwellings. The size of families has diminished. There are high-rises that weren't here in the 60s or the 70s or the 80s even, but they're often single residents in those high-rises. It's not an inexplicable phenomenon. It's outside the loop that the numbers are static or declining. That's more impressive. And let's turn to that, Bill.
Well, before we go to that, I want to fill out this inside the loop issue for a second. The other problem is that most of the people in this room hang out in the west side of town. So we see the Galleria and we see high-rise buildings and we see all that. Most of you have probably not been to Sunnyside or Houston, Trinity Gardens or Manchester or these old historic minority neighborhoods where back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, there was a mom and a dad and 3 or 4, maybe 5 kids and a 1,600 square foot tract house. And there was block after block after block of that. You go into those neighborhoods today, and that's not the case at all. What you see is a lot of old couples, widowers or widows, in a few places, some small families, but not with 5 or 6 kids. And so when we looked at the school enrollment, it was in those very neighborhoods where we saw sometimes campuses that had 25% of the kids that they were built for. But the suburbs have had this tremendous growth as people moved in. They didn't want to move into the city, and people in the city have been moving out to the suburbs. You know, when you talk about Harris County, over the last decade, about 200,000 more people have moved out of Harris County to someplace else in the United States than have moved into Harris County. Now, a lot of them didn't go very far. They went to Fort Bend County and Montgomery County and the Woodlands and places like that. But even that's beginning to slow because the reality is there's only a certain number of people to put in any of these places. I was speaking to the Charter School Association group not long ago, and they put on a land broker right in front of me. And he says, all that vacant land out there, that'll all be filled up with houses and people and new schools, and y'all need to get out there. And I got up and I said, well, I'm sorry, but I got to disagree because where are those people going to come from? Unless you're prepared to say we're going to let in a bunch of new immigrants from outside the country. Country doesn't really seem to be in the mood to do that, notwithstanding the current administration. Just the country's not in the mood to do that. So we're just not going to have much growth any place in the United States, probably for decades.
And Bill, this is a profound paradigm shift. Most of us in this room, our entire adult lives, certainly since the 50s, have been deurbanization, pave over the prairie or the forest, or the agricultural lands and build homes. Build them big, build them small, build them in tracts, build them individually, but move out. And what you're saying here is no. We may have seen a cresting of suburbanization of the United States.
It's going to slow dramatically. And this is, these are all on time scales. I spoke to the Houston Home Builder Association. I told them exactly that. I said, do not assume that it's going to be like it's been. I was talking to a bunch of school superintendents out at Region 4 here not too long ago, and they said, well, does this mean that I shouldn't be doing my X million dollar bond proposal that we've got at our school district? And I said, well, I'll just tell you this, and I want you to just think about this, how profound this statement is. There will never be more school-aged children in the state of Texas or in the United States than there are today. Every year from now on, there will be fewer school-aged children.
But what's unique and challenging about Houston from the appearance of things, Bill, and I'll contrast it with another city I'm quite familiar with, St. Louis. St. Louis is visibly hollowed out. Population has dropped from about 650,000 in 58 or 55 to about 230,000 now, and it continues to drop. The Catholic Church was the bellwether, not the school system. Parish after parish closed churches, closed their parish schools, then the public schools followed, but it's visible. You can see it. You can see it from overhead imagery. You can't in Houston. It's much more difficult.
That's because we've been propped up by international immigration. We're the Ellis Island for Latin America. This is where everybody comes. You go out to the Gulton area and look around, and there's just, huge groups of immigrants out there that have moved into the country the last couple of years. But the government says that a lot of people have left the country, have voluntarily deported. We've been trying to find that here, and frankly, we're not finding it anyplace. It's pretty clear that new people are not coming in. I don't think we're going to see dramatic declines, but I think you're going to see a slow decline in the urban core. The suburbs might grow a little bit and then level off and come down. But I think for the most part in our region, it's going to be fairly moderate in what we're going to see.
So, Bill, take a look at how Harris County, City of Houston, other cities that you've looked at are managing this phenomenon. How are we doing in terms of policy?
So I think we're still in the mindset, and because our population growth has been propped up by international migration, I think there's still some disconnect. And I'll give you an example of this. If you go look at HGAC's population projections for this area, I don't know, do y'all know what HGAC is, Houston Galveston Area Council? So Texas is divided up into about 12 or 13 regions, and they have typically a dozen or so counties in each region. And that's the planning organization for that region, and they distribute the federal highway money, and they do a lot of other things. But all of them have a demographic department. And if you go look at their projections, which are up on their website, they say the Houston region is going to be 10.4 million people by 2050. There is no way that's going to happen. What they do is they're looking backwards at what happened. And so the Kinder demographers and I went out and talked to them not long ago and said, look, it said in a nice way, but we said, y'all are crazy. This is not going to happen.
But in a nice way.
In a nice way. They sort of acknowledge that they're concerned about it, but they also sort of under their breath said, we're under pressure to make numbers look good. And I've heard the same thing from the state demographers. Elected officials don't want them out there saying that the state's not growing, that the county's not growing, because that's what they're trying to sell. So there's some real bias in the numbers when you look at these projections. I tell you, even when you look at, say, the UN projections, I will tell you that most academic demographers disagree with the UN projections and think that they are overly optimistic. And they get some of the same pressure. China doesn't want them showing a graph that says they're going to have half the population 75 years from now,
And if the census, the upcoming census, is changed, as the administration has said it wants, to not count non-U.S. citizens, I assume legal permanent residents will be counted, but who knows? It's going to come up even starker than your estimates.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that would be 20, 30 million people, probably something like that. I mean, it'd be a big number. I don't think they can do that, but under the Constitution. But look, if they're right and people decide they're going to leave, that would really be a dramatic impact. I mean, you would see that immediately. The government says 2.5 million people have left or been deported. I don't think that's true, but let's just say it were true. That's something you would immediately notice in the country.
Construction industry, industrial agriculture is seeing it. Lobster packers in Maine, they're seeing it as well.
One thing that I think is important, a concept to understand, is people sort of have the idea that immigrants come here and never leave. And that's never really been the case. Immigrants always go back home for all the reasons that people go back home. They get homesick, mom gets sick and you got to take care of her. You don't like it here. And so people have always gone back, probably several 100,000 a year before this latest change in immigration policy, naturally migrated back to their home. So if you just cut off the inflow, you're still going to have hundreds of thousands of people leaving every year. And so that's why the Census Bureau says we're going to stop growing in 2 or 3 years and start losing population.
Now, Bill, when you've looked at immigration and studied this, are you speaking about immigration as a whole, which includes documented, undocumented? What's the impact if you close down undocumented immigration or sharply restrict it, as is the case on the southern border today, but you leave open the other J1, H1B categories? How much does that make up for? Where was the bulk of that million number coming from?
So depends on the time you're talking about, but the million number has been pretty much legal migration, people that came to the country. What we had in the last several years, which frankly nobody really knows what the numbers are, but 2, 3, 4 million people a year coming in, something like that maybe, then that's just unprecedented in the country's history. But that propped up a lot of things, including here in Texas. And Texas is one of the major beneficiaries of that in terms of our population. But if you just go back to the million a year, that's still dramatically different than what we've been experiencing. Texas, year before last, had almost 600,000 international immigrants. So if we're only letting in 1 million a year in the whole country, we're not going to have 60% of them coming to Texas.
Tell me what the upside of the depopulation phenomenon is, Bill, for the U.S., for countries around the world.
So there's a lot of people that talk about this phenomenon as a real calamity, as catastrophic. These are very long arcs. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. If we went to every woman in the world only having one child, and we're currently double that rate right now, but if we went to every woman in the world only having one child from now on, human race would become extinct in about 700 years. If you go to 1.5 children, it takes almost 2,000 years for human beings to become extinct. Okay, so this is a very long runway we're talking about here. And I think what we've got to do is figure out how are we going to manage this. And let me bring it back to Houston for a second. So while our elected officials are not going to like to hear the idea that Houston's not growing, and certainly it's going to put pressure on our tax base, it also takes the pressure off of us for constantly expanding, constantly running out and doing new mud districts and building more freeways. It gives us a chance to go back and fix some of the stuff that maybe we didn't do so well the first time around, like having power lines and trees all over the place, having water systems that leak all over the where. Look, we grew so fast, we just built a lot of this city on the cheap, and it's catching up with us. And so the one thing about not growing is it gives us a little time to catch our breath, to try to catch up on some of this stuff.
See, it's not just Houston. 240 million gallons of untreated sewage has flowed into the Potomac from a 60-year-old interceptor. It's cities in general that need this done. So are you optimistic that, in fact, that kind of forward-looking approach will be adopted, Bill?
Not
Do you
really.
see it? Do you hear it?
No, I mean, when I go to hear the guy running TxDOT and he tells me 1,500 people a day are moving in, it doesn't make me very optimistic. And one of the reasons I wrote this book, and I'm out doing a lot of speaking on this topic, is to try to get the public to understand what's going on so they can start being reflected in public policy. HISD doesn't need to close a dozen schools. It needs to close about 30 or 40 schools. Now, closing schools is painful. People don't like it.
What's the number right now, Bill, of announced closures?
I think 13, and we need to close probably 3 times that many. But we've got to be realistic about what's going on. And there's a lot of ramifications from not taking the appropriate actions. And let's just take schools, for example. It's so unpopular. Keeping those schools open, first of all, it's very expensive. Secondly, you can't go recapture the capital by selling off the land and maybe putting it to some other use. But worse than that, when you start having so few kids in a school that you can't afford to have a school nurse, or you can't afford to have an art program. You can't do the things to enhance the education. It's not fair to the kids anymore.
It's tough, though, Bill. You know this.
Absolutely.
It's tough because you close a school, you close a parish church, and what you're signaling is this community's finished. It's over all but the telling.
Well, and I went to school there. I mean, my kids went to school there, all that civic pride that we have about things.
Rational, yeah.
Yes, of course.
But very, very tough to do. You can look at New Orleans after Katrina, at the so-called jack-o'-lantern parishes, 1 or 2 homes lit up, the rest totally demolished because nobody could take the decision that these entire tracts need to go back to be wetlands or whatever the appropriate purpose would be. Wetlands isn't a bad idea for Houston either, but
the whole topic.
It's near impossible to do as a political matter. So this is a struggle, and it's not unique to Houston.
No, it's difficult. It is being done, though. Alding's closed 6 or 7 schools. Spring closed a couple. Fort Bend, I think, announced they're closing 7 schools. So it is happening. They're all getting grief about doing it, but it is happening. It's just a financial reality for them because, in Texas, one of their major income streams is what they call WADA, which is a daily allowance the state pays them for how many kids they have in schools. So if all of a sudden you've got fewer kids and you're trying to maintain all these schools, it just becomes a physical matter. You can't afford to do it anymore.
And tax bases, Bill, particularly in the complex, multi-layered tax base, schools, local municipalities, etc., that we pay here in Harris County. Where does that go?
So the tax base will go down eventually. I've been watching this pretty closely. The HCAD has this report that shows you what the total taxable base is for all of Harris County. And it generally goes up 3 or 4% a year, something like that. It's up a little less than that right now, but they have an unprecedented number of people who have protested their taxes and are litigating those taxes. I think when all that washes out, we're probably going to see the tax base about flat for this current year. A lot of that's in office buildings. I mean, the values there have just plummeted. I got a flyer from one of the big commercial realtors the other day that had all the office building closings for last year in 2025. And I'm flipping through and looking at them, and I mean, these are huge, beautiful buildings. They're going for 10 cents on the dollar.
Tell us what's happened to the property base in the city of Houston.
And, you get retail struggling with all the online stuff. So there's a lot of pressure on the property tax base, and I think that's going to continue.
Stuff's moving off the base entirely.
Residential, frankly, has been carrying it the last couple of years because I'm sure you've all gotten your appraisal bills and weren't happy about them at all. But I will tell you, even there, they're starting to feel some pressure on that. Right now, we have many more sellers in the market than we have buyers for single-family houses.
And that was before FEMA finally released the preliminary maps, having held onto them for 5 years.
We'll have another discussion about that one night.
We're going to be coming up with that. Why those maps look as dramatic as they do, both in terms of properties traditionally in the 100-year floodplain moving off, not just to 500, but just off completely, and properties including where we sit today that are in the deep red in terms of subsidence, other issues that have increased the flood risk. But that's another factor. So Bill, a bit of a future look here. Does any of this eventually make concepts which right now are forbidden to speak about, like a VAT, consumption tax, impossible to contemplate?
Look, this
not for Texas, not for Houston,
No, I understand, yeah.
but for the nation.
Well, and really for the globe. So you've got two things going on right now which are unprecedented in human history. First of all, the population decline. By the way, this has never happened in the history of humankind. We've been around about 300,000 years, and women have always had around 5 to 8 kids until 1970. In 1970, all of a sudden, the rate started coming down. It's down to around 2 right now. The global rate's down to 2. And by the way, the only place where the rates are still higher, substantially higher than that, are equatorial Africa. But even there, the birth rates are coming down. So this is unprecedented in human history. And so trying to get our brains around what that looks like is very difficult for us. But the other thing that's going on is technology is just accelerating and accelerating and accelerating. For those of you that follow the stock market, you've seen what's happened to the software companies here in just the last few days, talking about being completely replaced by AI. The robotics get more and more sophisticated all the time. So you've got these two things going on. You've got fewer people, but you've also got less demand for labor going forward. Now, those two things move together. They're both moving the same direction, but they're probably not moving at the same speed. The technology is probably moving a lot faster than the population decline is. So that's going to cause a lot of disruptions. I think a lot of people having difficult finding something useful to do that somebody's willing to pay them for. So I think the thing that you might see is something like UBI, Universal Basic Income. I think that's the more likely outcome, paying people
rather than a VAT.
You know, taxing capital and then having that tax on the capital somehow redistributed.
Tough issue to even begin talking about.
Absolutely. But, you know, at some point in time when you've got millions of people out there milling around unemployed, it starts looking like 1930 again, you know, things will change.
And we are, by most estimates, 7 years, 8 to 10 at an absolute outside away from a genuine crisis for the entitlement programs, for Medicare and Social Security. That is to say, the point at which there are only two options: a bipartisan a la 1985, Jim Baker was one of the champions of that, along with Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill, George Shultz at the Treasury, to get a bipartisan deal to reset entitlement programs. That is, fundamentally look at the taxes, the age brackets, the year in which you become entitled to your maximum benefit, all of that stuff. Or you kick it down the road, but kicking it down the road 7 to 10 years from now will be kicking it on top of something that did not exist in 1985, which is the magnitude of the debt, the Treasury debt burden, and the amount of revenue now committed to interest payments on the debt.
And the population was still growing.
And the population was still growing. Exactly. So you got real issues here without a very cogent public policy approach, which has to be bipartisan. It cannot be gotcha. And the crisis will come. Something's got to be done to it. Right now, my betting is on kick the can, grow the deficit, grow the interest payment, because it's just too hard to do something else. But even that will ultimately, again, I'll quote Jim Baker, lead us to another more profound crisis, which is a crisis in the dollar, Treasury paper, and the bond market. We've seen flutters of that, but we've not really seen a crisis coming in. But we could. So, Bill, what is your prescription right now? Just focus on Harris County, state of Texas. What should be done that isn't being done?
Well, we need to start being realistic about projects. And I'll give you a couple of things. Some of you that follow me know I've been a longtime critic of transit. Transit absolutely does not work in this new environment because it depends on population density. And Houston will never be any denser than it is today. Matter of fact, it will be less dense going forward. You add to that the technology of on-demand service from Uber and Lyft and those kind of people, and ultimately autonomous driving. The future of mobility is going to be point-to-point, on-demand custom service. You know, we're not going to be getting on a bunch of trains and traveling together any place because there's not going to be enough of us to get on it to make it economically feasible. But anyway, and I'll give you another example. There's a group of people out there that are advocating that we build a new toll road out the Hempstead Highway. Nonsense. We don't need a toll road out the Hempstead Highway. You know, so these are the kinds of bad decisions we got to stop making, and we need to refocus on things like making this area more resilient, because we live on a big flat coastal plain where hurricanes come all the time. So, I'd really like to get those electric wires down out of the trees. I'd really like to, I'd like to build the Ike Dike because I'd like to see, us be able to fend off some of this water coming from the other. There's some things that we need to be focused on, and we frankly don't have the luxury of wasting money on vanity projects because we think we're growing when we're really not.
But the cost of what you just mentioned, not the Ike Dike, but burying power lines, whether it's Arlington, Texas, or Arlington, Virginia, is phenomenal. Just phenomenal. The disruption to property, the trenching, the burial, it is in the multiples of billions of dollars.
It is.
Numbers of.
If you're interested in this topic, Paul Hobby did a really neat study after Hurricane Ike where they looked at this. And there are things that you can do. For example, every time we redo a street in Houston, we ought to use an opportunity to drop the line because it's a lot cheaper to do it if you got the street open already. Those are the kinds of decisions we need to be making right now and not worry about saving money to go build some gigantic toll road out to the Hempstead Highway that would never be used.
We will be talking more, Bill, undoubtedly about this, but I'm very proud that here on the Rice campus, we at the Baker Institute and Kinder had been the leaders in terms of trying to right set the numbers, the fact base. That's what we do. It's tough, but policy decisions and fiscal decisions based on anything other than the real numbers and the real projections are going to take us to a worse place by far, not just here in Houston and Harris County or Texas, but nationally, than if we confront this now with rational or more rational policy decisions. This has been Baker Briefing, where we make the news make sense. The podcast is brought to you by Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, which delivers nonpartisan policy research on the most pressing issues facing the United States, Texas, and the world. Share your feedback and your guest or topic suggestions at bakerbriefing@rice.edu. This episode was produced by Shannon Moriarty with production support from our Rice student intern, Maggie Siganova. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Additional support from Ed Bailey, Leslie Marie Aguilar, and Victoria Jupp. You can check out our other podcasts, keep up with our latest research and events at bakerinstitute.org. Thank you for joining us.